Welcome to the Saturday Cup of Joe on Sunday. Actually, don't have coffee either, so really it's a cup of tea on Sunday. But I already had 3 cups of coffee, so I'm cheating on coffee with tea. But week 250 of the Cup of Joe felt like a milestone. I don't know why we factor round numbers and whole numbers into our milestones, but 250 is somewhat of a milestone. So I actually went back and looked at week one. I had called it the Cup of Joe, a companion to your coffee at that time. And while it's evolved, there's actually a bunch of stuff in there that remain the same. So there were, I think, it centered around similarities to things you'll still see in this week's new ideas, innovation, and in small ways to improve our decision making or improve our leadership. I think a lot of those are still you'll see in what we covered today about how to think about problems differently or innovation, even as the legal counsel at that time as a lawyer in legal. And I think the seeds were, you could see the seeds are evident in thinking about innovation and thinking about technology and how it can push us into creating new ideas, acting on new ideas. One of the things I found in the first week was this concept of impact versus influence, and the fact that impact is what drives results, which is where value is created. So you should be measuring less your influence and more your impact. And that's a concept that has been true for many, many weeks of the Cup of Joe. I talked in there a little bit about cities and technology and what Google was doing in Kansas City and what similarities were to Detroit and how we could bring technology and innovation to Detroit and improve our cities. There's also this today's thought at the end, and today's thought in week one was little hinges swing big doors. That's a concept that I still use today in my innovation work on my team. What's the smallest amount of application? What's the smallest change we could make to create the largest impact, to create the largest leverage? And what are those levers that you're using on your team, that you're using in your company, you're using in your industry, no matter what your industry is? So, still true in week one to week 250 in many cases. But I wanted to talk this week a lot about home ownership, a lot about thinking differently, and a lot about racial equality and racial justice in housing and home ownership in the country, in our history. One of the things that made me want to do this on a Sunday, on February 21st, was over the weekend, I watched Malcolm X, the Spike Lee movie starring Denzel Washington. And I had been flipping through, I guess it's HBO's app, and saw that Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21st. So about a week ago, I planned that, you got to kind of plan ahead for Malcolm X, as captivating a movie and as meaningful a movie, and Denzel's performance is, and it is, and they are. It was also 3 hours and 22 minutes, and so I couldn't actually just sit down and watch it in one night or in a weeknight. I had to save it for Friday and finished it up last night. But I felt like there was a lot in there that tells us not only about our 400-year history, in North America, but and the treatment of Africans brought over here, of African Americans in the last 200 years, and specifically of, Black Americans in the last 50 years. That there's a lot in there that should inform how we think about 2020 and 2021. And so just, you know, it is Black History Month, and I haven't addressed it as directly on the Cup of Joe this month, but I really did want to. And I didn't want to make this a, hey, I watched Malcolm X type of approach. That's not the case at all. I'm not looking to take credit for being a white guy watching Malcolm X talking about racial justice. I think it's important. These days are important. These anniversaries are important. These months of awareness are important to inform how we move ahead every single day for the rest of the year and the rest of our careers, the rest of our lives. So if 250 is a milestone in the Cup of Joe that I'm going to recognize, then February 21st and the assassination of Malcolm X and what he said and what he tried to get people to think about every day was an important thing to highlight. It also rings true throughout this week because whether it's the National Association of Realtors, the New York Times, NerdWallet, there were several, research studies and surveys released this week that talk specifically about first-time homebuyers, about Black homeowners, and about the gap in racial homeownership between white Americans, Asian Americans, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans. And I'll put some of the links and charts in the actual post if you'd like the links and you'd like to do more reading on this, especially the National Association of Realtors research deck has a bunch of fascinating things in it. One I found particularly compelling in 2019. There were 3 states without a black home buyer. Zero. Zero black home buyers in 3 of our states. I think that still shows you just how concentrated population centers are, just how important access to credit and really structural policy and legal infrastructure needs to be to make sure that the system, banking system, like I said, the policies and politics are being applied fairly. Before I jump to the NAR study, though, I just wanted to make one interesting comment about first-time homebuyers broadly, of all races, which is what the New York Times was focused on. It was about a little over a third of the respondents did reference down payment as one of their barriers. They don't have enough saved for a down payment. Um, and the other uh, 2 highest results to make up the top 3 were credit score or fear that the credit score wasn't high enough, and then the pandemic, buying a house with the uncertainty of location or the uncertainty of the future. And so if you think about those top 3, whether it's just above a third or just under a third of respondents, it makes up a big portion of the market and the available and eligible home buyers. I'll put a tweet someone sent me, and if you sent it to me, I apologize for not remembering. I've copy and pasted it to so many people and talked about it so much this week, I actually forgot who sent it to me. But it's a tweet from someone who said, apparently, the bank thinks I can't afford a $950 a month mortgage, so I guess I'll keep paying my $1,400 a month in rent. And it got me thinking, how we think about measuring and categorizing value and how we, you know, I don't love sports analogies, but I'm going to use one later about, home field advantage. And I want to start thinking differently about home buyers and particularly black home buyers relative to home field advantage. And I'll explain why in a second. But I think it's important to frame up why I'm focused on black home ownership, not only in this post, but in my work, and why the housing industry, the mortgage industry, the real estate industry, and frankly, the Biden administration are all thinking and talking about black home ownership at this moment. Yes, a lot of the attention, awareness, and resources have flowed out of the protests of the murder of George Floyd and of the attention the Black Lives Matter movement brought to these issues of safety, these issues of security, these issues of wealth, and the systemic pressures, barriers, and really attacks on certain races, whether you go all the way back to the 1930s and you're talking about the Federal Home Loan Corporation, or you're bringing it forward to how real estate agents, FICO score, and the other economics of home buying affect different classes and different races and different urban areas differently. So the NAR study for 2020, will show you going back 11 years, 2009 to 2019, that white home ownerships rates have stayed relatively consistent, somewhere between 69% and 71% of white Americans own a home. Drop down Asian Americans, it's about 60. It's kind of ranging between 59 and 60 in any given year for that 10-year span. And Hispanic, 48%, and Black, 42%. And so when we talk about the home ownership gap or that wealth gap, it's that 30% difference, that 40% of Blacks, 70% of whites, and obviously Hispanics and Asians falling in between. And what that should tell us about how we build economic development, how we build communities, how we build an economy, and how we can create, I think, more stability and more activity by looking at value differently. Yes, we need to address this for the statement it makes about how people were treated and are treated in this country and in our economy. And then also, on top of that, the amount of innovation, the amount of progress, the amount of economic activity that we can generate. We're always talking about stimulating the economy in one way or another. That's government, right? The allocation of limited resources. And so I think home ownership and housing in particular stands at a moment when we can absolutely do that this year. We can find ways that generate broad fair, and equitable economic activity in communities that have been historically discriminated against, as well as generating business that thrives in all types of different economic conditions and across all types of geographies. So, when I mentioned earlier home field advantage, it was interesting because this year created a scenario in in professional sports where statisticians and others, journalists, could study home field advantage. Why? Well, those sports like football, who are still playing at home but doing so without a crowd, allowed one control group where there was home field but no fans of that home team. What that did. In hockey, they had two bubbles, so two arenas that hosted, and the home team still maintained some of the advantages that the home team gets in hockey relative to face-offs and line changes, but without any of the other trappings. So think, home stadium with no fans in football, neutral ice, but with the home team advantages in hockey. And then in other sports like basketball and baseball, uh, where they played the World Series at a neutral field. They play basketball. All the games were in Orlando, and there was no home court and no fans, and that type of thing. And so the four major sports allowed people to think differently about stadiums, about crowds, and about it is home field advantage a real thing? And we can't measure it, but we feel like it's true. One of the things I started thinking about was how little we do to look at home buyers in their home field, in their home turf. Most people end up buying homes in the places where they live. Yes, people move across the country. Yes, there's relocation. And especially in 2020, we heard a lot about remote workers finding new cities. But that overall is a relatively small number of people compared to those that are buying homes within the zip code, within the town, or within, call it 10 to 20 miles. I don't have the research on that, but I'm just saying in the course of thinking about this and learning about it, I would say it's true. So, you know, in um, in housing, how do we, use this opportunity here in 2020, 2021 as we think about what community means, what cities mean, what home ownership means, and how we take a look at some new data, some new ideas, some new innovations. One that comes to mind for me is how paying rent in a place where you are then buying the home should calculate to a greater degree in your underwriting. If you're actually paying rent in a place for 5, 10 years, then trying to buy a home in that same place, whether it's like right across the line in the next town over or in the town where you're actually renting, my point is you have a connection to the community. You have a home field advantage. You're familiar with a place and with the community. You have some support systems. We don't have a way to categorize that. We don't have a way to calculate that. We don't have a way to put that into the underwriting software and factor it in to how it addresses ability to repay risk or credit risk over 30 years. But this is giving us opportunities to think differently. This is giving us opportunities to collect more data. Fintech is giving us opportunities to see rent payments in a more standardized way than we'd ever seen them before. So paying your landlord in cash in an envelope or paying your landlord in a check that you drop off at their door or mail to them versus PayPal or versus Cash App or as direct bill pay out of your checking account. Now tools that didn't exist 10 years ago exist to standardize, calculate, and automate the process of underwriting. So how we think about that, I have an article in this week's, I'll post the link. I saw an article in this week's Fast Company about building affordable housing that has some other interest, business interest, alongside of the affordable housing to make the economics work. So instead of retail on the street level and housing above, the way a lot of mixed use properties go, this was actually a vertical urban farm in the building, like a greenhouse, right next to affordable housing that kind of stood behind the vertical farm. And do the benefits of the vertical farm, some environmental benefits, but also the economic benefits of constructing things that way, help create more value in the building to offset the barriers to entry to owning a home or renting a home in that building. That's just one small example, but it's one that I think changes the game when we think about what's possible. So I've rambled on a little bit about, connecting these ideas, and you may think that home field advantage link to the way I'm thinking about the the innovation piece is a little bit attenuated, but to me it was interesting to think that when we start calculating things differently, when we're given an opportunity to evaluate things differently in the pandemic, it actually creates innovation and should create an innovation. And so, to me, they were related, though not directly, but it was 2020 gave us this chance to learn more about something hard to quantify, hard to understand, and systemic injustice, racial injustice in the FICO score, racial injustice in home ownership opportunities and access to credit is hard to understand. It's multifaceted. It's everything from income equality to job opportunities to the supply. What's the condition of actual homes and available homes around the country where people live, or where they want to live. And so it's just as hard as some things that we spend more time looking at, like professional sports. So it felt to me like a way to kind of encourage all of us to think differently about innovation, and particularly housing innovation, because that's what I'm curious about right now. But hopefully this has been, you know, whether it's week 1 or week 250, it's about ideas, it's about innovation, and it's about small ways that we can improve, incremental improvement in our leadership, in our companies, in our decision making, and ultimately in how we treat each other in society. So go out and watch Malcolm X for sure. It's worth it. It's definitely worth your time. Think, read, and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much.